In 1884, legislation was passed granting the vote to all men owning or renting land valued at £10, increasing the electorate to approximately 60% of all males. This led trade union members to seek political representation to support the previously unrepresented working classes. As a result, in the year 1900, the Labour Party was formed. However, at the turn of the 20th century, the Liberals were in power, a party whose principles were personal liberty, social reform, and reducing the powers of the Crown and the Church. In the period prior to World War I, the Liberals made a huge political impact, passing welfare reforms that created the basis of the welfare state in the United Kingdom, including medical and unemployment insurance and old age pensions. Referred to as New Liberalism, the tax policies and social reforms enacted in this period marked a significant shift in the political landscape, with broader acceptance that instead of a minimal laissez-faire government, the state can play an active and positive role in supporting individual freedom and fulfilment. On the 4th of August, 1914, in support of France, as well as with the intention of keeping the Liberal Party united, Prime Minister Asquith declared war against Germany and its allies. Governing throughout World War I was deeply damaging to the Liberals, and a crisis over a shortage of artillery shells and ammunition ultimately led to the formation of a Liberal-Conservative coalition where many Liberals lost their seats. In 1916, the Conservatives withdrew their support for Asquith, instead backing Lloyd George, who led a Conservative majority coalition to victory in 1918, governing with what many deemed an anti-Liberal agenda in an all-out attempt to win the war. Following the victory, Lloyd George retained power in the Conservative coalition for a further 4 years. The impact of World War I led to the fragmentation and consequent decline of the Liberal Party, and by the end of the 1920s, Labour had replaced the Liberals as the Conservatives' main rivals, forming the first government in 1924. Unfortunately for Labour, it was a minority government lasting only 9 months. The interwar years were otherwise dominated by Stanley Baldwin of the Conservatives, who held office 3 times between 1923 and 1935. Owing to World War I, the UK did not experience any economic boom in the 1920s, and was still recovering from the war when the New York Stock Exchange market collapsed, triggering the Great Depression, much to the surprise of many commentators, including the modern father of economics, John Maynard Keynes. The effects were immediate, with a doubling of unemployment to 2.5 million at a time where unemployment benefits were minimal, leading to a significant increase in poverty and malnutrition. Consequently, the inexperienced Labour Party was swept aside in a landslide Conservative victory in 1931, where a period of austerity ensued. Cuts were made to public spending, wages, and unemployment benefit, as well as an increase in income tax. This only had a deflationary effect on the economy, which led to a further sharp increase in unemployment. The exodus of capital and gold from the UK forced the government to abandon the gold standard in 1931, a monetary system where a country's paper currency is pegged to a fixed amount of gold. Despite widespread fears of the economic impact, it devalued the pound by 25% against the dollar, boosting the value of exports and leading the way to a gradual economic recovery. This period is also characterized by the rise of a more egalitarian society, most notably women's fight for equal voting rights. After decades of campaigning, the women's suffrage movement succeeded through laws enacted first in 1918 and a decade later in 1928, where the Conservative government passed legislation granting anyone over 21 the right to vote on equal terms. By 1936, Baldwin was facing the unique challenge of a monarch in King Edward VIII who wished to marry an American socialite named Mrs. Simpson, known for her pro-German sympathies. As British monarch, Edward was the nominal head of the Church of England, which did not allow divorced people to remarry. Consequently, opposition arose on religious, legal, political and moral grounds. The only option for Edward was abdication, renouncing his own throne, which to much national surprise he did in December of that year, passing his title on to his brother Albert, known as George VI, whose daughter Elizabeth II remains the monarch to this day. George was coronated in 1937, and wishing to end his premiership after a bout of nervous exhaustion, Baldwin resigned the following day. He told a backbench MP, around the time, "I had a success, my dear Nicholson, at the moment I most needed it. Now is the time to go. Baldwin handed over to Neville Chamberlain. After numerous attempts at appeasement, summits and foreign policy trips, and despite the Anglo-German agreement Chamberlain negotiated with Hitler, which secured a period of peace, Germany invaded Czechoslovakia in March 1939. On the 1st of September, after more futile attempts at appeasement, Germany invaded Poland, and on the following day, the UK declared a state of war with Germany. At the start of the war, there was a general feeling that most Allied officials and generals felt the war could be won relatively quickly by keeping economic pressure on Germany whilst continuing rearmament. After a failed strategy with Norway, which held strategic iron ore reserves, confidence in Chamberlain fell, culminating in Chamberlain threatening resignation unless the Labour Party agreed to form a government with him. Labour agreed, but only under a new Conservative leader. Halifax, Chamberlain's right-hand man, effectively declined the position of Prime Minister, favouring Churchill as a wartime leader. Upon taking over from Chamberlain, Churchill began to oppose any immediate peace negotiations, and rallied the nation against Hitler with a series of inspiring speeches, one including the words, "We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." Ultimately, Churchill led the nation and its allies from the brink of defeat to victory in a war involving every major power and over 30 countries, with casualties upwards of 85 million people. In June 1944, upon the surrender of Nazi Germany to a huge crowd in Whitehall, Churchill said, "This is your victory," to which the crowd replied, "No, it is yours." Following victory in World War II, in the first election since 1935, Clement Attlee led Labour to a significant majority and as Prime Minister led a programme of socialist reform, including nationalisation of the Bank of England, public utilities, mining and other heavy industry. This government set about establishing a comprehensive welfare state, the jewel in the crown being the National Health Service that first began running services in 1947 that were free to all at the point of access, funded through taxation. The 1950s marked a period of Conservative dominance. Churchill retired in 1955, succeeded by Anthony Eden. The following year, Israel, France, and the UK invaded Egypt in an attempt to regain control of the recently nationalised Suez Canal, which was used for trade, only to withdraw shortly after the fighting had started after international pressure from the US, the Soviet Union, and the UN, which led to Eden's swift resignation. Harold Macmillan governed from 1957 to 1963, where he initially focused on rebuilding the damaged relationship with the United States following the Suez Crisis, overseeing a period of low unemployment and steadily rising living standards and social reforms, including a reduction in the standard work week from 48 hours to 42. Labour returned to power in 1964 under Harold Wilson and continued in a similar vein to the previous Labour government, rolling out a series of social reforms, including the partial decriminalisation of homosexuality and abortion, the relaxing of divorce laws, and the end of capital punishment, although this period was also marked by the outbreak of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. Edward Heath restored the Conservatives to power in 1970. After applications in the 60s to join the European Economic Community were rejected by France, whose president said Britain harboured a deep-seated hostility to any European project, the UK was successful in joining the EEC, taking effect in 1973. Labour and Harold Wilson returned to power in 1974, in a term that was marred by strikes over wage increases in a period of high inflation, at one point exceeding 25%. This culminated in the winter of 1978, known as the Winter of Discontent. With high inflation and crippling strike action, Margaret Thatcher was elected as the first female Prime Minister, campaigning on a promise to wrestle back control from the trade unions, and the famous advert that Labour isn't working. Through a series of legislative acts, the Thatcher government broke the power of the unions and collective action, and as a result, strikes were at their lowest level for 30 years by the time of the 1983 general election. This, along with broad denationalisation, proved to be a catastrophic catalyst for sweeping economic decline in industrial towns in the north and across the nation, ripping the heart out of communities that depended on jobs in mining in particular. It also marked the decline for towns with a focus on manufacturing, as the UK accelerated its transition to a service-led economy. Thatcher's economic policy, or Thatcherism, was heavily influenced by economists such as Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek, focused on tax cuts, deregulation, and an emphasis on free markets and individual liberty. Denationalisation included British Telecom, British Gas, and British Airways, amongst others, and it was this denationalisation, tax cuts for higher earners, and cuts to the welfare state that resulted in Thatcher being one of the most controversial and divisive prime ministers in the UK's political history, bitterly hated by the left and adorned by the conservative right. After the introduction of a highly unpopular poll tax, Thatcher fell out of favour and John Major took control, winning a fourth consecutive election in 1992. Despite having a far more conciliatory approach to politics than the decisive Iron Lady, after a year in office, support for Major had slumped, and a defining act in his premiership was negotiating an opt-out clause in the Treaty of Maastricht, providing a legal right to not join the European single currency project. In 1997, Labour swept a landslide victory under a young new leader, Tony Blair, who aimed to blend social progressiveness with competitive free market economic policy, rebranding the party New Labour in a bid to distance the party from previous Labour policies and socialism. Under Blair's leadership, Labour went on to win two further elections in 2001 and 2005. Championing multiculturalism, immigration soared, especially after the government welcomed immigrants from new EU member states in 2004, contributing to the rise of Euroscepticism, and this was arguably a key factor in conceding to a referendum on EU membership 12 years later. Whilst other progressive policies were rolled out, including devolution of power to Scotland and Wales, the Minimum Wage Act and the Freedom of Information Act, his support for wars in Afghanistan and Iraq were highly controversial and led to a significant drop in his popularity, his resignation, and ultimately his succession by Gordon Brown. Brown's time in Number 10 will be remembered largely for the financial crisis of 2008, where retrospectively Gordon Brown, along with Alistair Darling, were widely considered to save the UK and global banking industry from catastrophic collapse, if not total collapse, through an enforced recapitalisation programme, in effect buying stakes in a number of troubled banks. After the 2010 election, David Cameron of the Conservatives formed a coalition with the Liberal Democrats, their first since World War II, embarking on a period of austerity in response to the financial crash that proved highly unpopular, especially with Lib Dem voters. Cameron agreed to the Scottish independence referendum held in 2014, in which Scotland decided to remain as part of the UK with 55% of the vote. Cameron's government also supported the introduction of gay marriage despite many Conservative MPs voting against it. Increasing Euroscepticism and persistent pressure from the UKIP party and from within the Conservative Party led Cameron to attempt to negotiate reform with the EU in an attempt to curb migration. He agreed concessions that made it harder for immigrants in the UK to access the welfare state. This did little to appease the Eurosceptics and led Cameron to use the promise of an in-out referendum on EU membership as a bargaining chip to retain power in the 2015 general election. In June 2016, after a referendum, the UK voted to leave the European Union on a vote of 52%. This redefined political boundaries in the country. No longer were people identifiable as right or left wing, but also as Leave or Remain. Cameron, who campaigned for Remain, was blamed for undertaking in a selfish political gamble that backfired catastrophically and proved to be incredibly divisive. He swiftly resigned following the result of the referendum, with Theresa May succeeding him as the second female Conservative Prime Minister. The rest of her term was marred with government being found in contempt of Parliament for withholding legal advice on Brexit, 2 votes of no confidence, and several rejected Brexit deals. After 3 years of attempting and largely failing to make progress with the UK's Brexit negotiations, Theresa May resigned. Viewed within the Conservative Party as the man to get Brexit done, Boris Johnson was swiftly elected as the leader of the Conservative Party and as Prime Minister. Shortly after his appointment, Johnson asked the Queen to prorogue Parliament and enforce break of Parliament in an attempt to stop the blocking of a no-deal Brexit. Many found this to undermine democracy, with John Bercow, the Speaker of the House, calling it a constitutional outrage. After a legal challenge, the prorogation ended up in the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom, which deemed it unlawful, rendering it null and void, Parliament resumed the next day. After a period of toxic political game playing and the loss of the Conservative majority due to a defecting Conservative MP, a general election was held in December of 2019. The British people faced a stark choice between the most left-wing radical Labour government in decades under Jeremy Corbyn and the Brexit at all costs right-wing Conservative government. In a disastrous night for the Labour Party, Johnson and the Conservatives secured the largest majority since Thatcher, with Labour losing countless seats in previous Labour strongholds across the country, in what can be seen as a rejection of the radical left-wing policies of the Corbyn era. So, what can we expect in 2020 and beyond? Brexit will finally happen, although it won't be over anytime soon. It will continue to dominate British politics, with ongoing negotiations and trade deal talks, and undoubtedly will continue to be an extremely divisive issue. The Labour Party will hold its leadership election for the replacement of Jeremy Corbyn, a pivotal moment where the party and its members will decide whether or not to depart from the radical politics of the Corbyn era to a more centre-left position. The wrong choice could lead to the longest period of Conservative government in the last 100 years. Whatever happens, it will be interesting. Please see the references for this video in the description, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more content.